Mr. Grimsby's voice cut across the piano department like a lid slammed shut. "Miss Fenner, something simple, if you please. Nothing fancy. Mr. Pemberton Reeve has not got all afternoon." I was standing not 10 feet away with my daughter Constance's gloved hand in mine, waiting my own turn at the counter, and I confess, I turned toward the sound the way one turns toward any small unkindness, dressed up as instruction. It was a Tuesday in October, the year 1902, and I had come to Whitmore & Sons on Oxford Street to buy Constance a piano for her 16th birthday. I had not come to witness anything at all, but some afternoons arrange themselves without asking your permission, and this was one of them. The department was a cathedral of polished rosewood and black lacquer, 40 instruments or more, standing in ranks beneath a glass roof, and every one of them catching the gray London light and throwing it back gold. At the center of the floor stood a concert grand so vast and so gleaming that Constance had already drifted toward it before I could stop her, running one small finger along its closed lid, as though she might wake it. Beside that grand piano stood the man Mr. Grimsby had addressed his impatience to, a Mr. Aldous Pemberton Reeve, a stout gentleman in a fur-collared coat, who kept consulting his watch with the particular irritation of a man convinced that every clerk in London existed solely to delay him. He had announced to the room in general, a piano suitable for his wife's drawing room, and he wanted to hear it played before he spent a single shilling on it, and he wanted the business concluded before his 4 o'clock appointment. The air in that hall always carried the smell of beeswax polish and fresh sheet music, and beneath it, faintly, the cold iron smell of the tram lines outside the great windows, and the whole floor was carpeted so thickly that even a crowd of onlookers could gather and shuffle and murmur without ever quite disturbing the hush a piano department seems to demand of everyone who enters it, whether they know a scale from a symphony or not. And there, between the impatience of the customer and the anxiety of the manager, stood the girl. She could not have been more than 22, slight in build, in a plain gray demonstrator's uniform, with a small brass badge pinned above her heart that read, Miss A. Fenner. Her hands were folded in front of her, and there was a stillness in the way she held herself that I noticed even then, before I understood what it meant. The stillness of someone who has learned to make herself small in rooms that do not expect much of her. "Something simple," Mr. Grimsby said again, lower now, for her ears alone, though I was near enough to catch every word. "A song, a hymn tune, nothing that will frighten him off with grandness. We are selling a piece of furniture, Miss Fenner, not giving a concert." He said it not unkindly. I want to be fair to him, looking back, for he was not a cruel man, only a harried one, a man whose department's takings were watched weekly by men above him who cared nothing for music and everything for ledgers. But kindness and carelessness can wear remarkably similar coats, and it was carelessness, that afternoon, that very nearly cost him the finest thing his department would ever produce. Miss Fenner said nothing. She only inclined her head, the smallest possible motion, the motion of someone long practiced in swallowing replies, and crossed to the great piano, where Mr. Pemberton Reeve stood tapping his watch chain against his waistcoat button. I ought to explain, because I did not know it myself until later, how a girl of 22 came to be standing in a department store selling pianos to impatient men instead of sitting at a proper instrument in a proper hall. I learned it afterward, in pieces, the way one learns anything true. Alice Fenner's father had been a modest man of business in Clapham, and before his firm collapsed in the year of the panic, he had paid for his daughter to study under old Mr. Aldridge, the organist of St. Michael's, a teacher of some reputation, who had once, it was said, played for a duchess. Alice had shown, by every account I later gathered, a gift that startled even Aldridge, who was not a man easily startled. But when her father's fortunes fell, so fell the lessons, so fell the hopes of any conservatory, and Alice Fenner had gone, at 19, to earn her 4 shillings a day, playing scraps of melody to help Whitmore & Sons move its stock. She played for the customers, as the advertisement in the window put it, 20 minutes of every hour, whatever was asked of her, and asked never for anything grander than her wages. She sat now at the great instrument, arranged her gray skirts with one economical motion, and rested her hands lightly upon the keys, waiting for Mr. Pemberton Reeves' nod. "Something the wife would like," he said, waving a gloved hand. "A little air, nothing that will rattle the china." A ripple of quiet laughter went round the small crowd that had begun, as crowds do, to gather from nowhere. Two shopgirls pausing with bolts of ribbon, an elderly clerk from the sheet music counter, a boy in a page's uniform, who had no business there at all and knew it. Mr. Grimsby folded his arms and looked at his shoes. I felt, standing there with Constance's hand still in mine, a small, hot indignation on the girl's behalf that I could not have explained to anyone, least of all myself. Miss Fenner lifted her chin very slightly, and then, instead of the polite drawing-room trifle everyone in that department was braced to hear, she began to play Rachmaninoff. I did not know, in that first instant, what it was. I knew only that the sound which came from beneath her hands did not belong to a department store, did not belong to a Tuesday afternoon, did not belong, indeed, to anything I had ever expected to hear between the ribbon counter and the umbrella stand. It began low and dark, a restless rolling figure in the left hand, urgent as footsteps hurrying down a corridor, and above it a melody rose that seemed to be searching for something it had lost and was afraid it would never find. Mr. Pemberton Reeves' watch chain stopped its nervous jingling. His hand simply dropped to his side, forgotten, the watch dangling. Somewhere behind me, a shopgirl set down a bolt of ribbon she had been carrying. Quite without seeming to notice she had done it, and I heard the soft thud of it landing on the counter, as though it belonged to another room entirely, a room already left behind. I felt Constance's fingers tighten around mine. The room, which a moment before had been full of small sounds, footsteps, the rustle of paper, a distant till closing, went very quiet, the particular quiet that falls when everyone present understands, without being told, that something is happening that will not happen twice. Mr. Grimsby's folded arms slowly unfolded. He took one step nearer the piano, as a man steps nearer a fire he had not expected to find in a cold room. She was playing the fourth of the moment's musico, Opus 16, a piece I would later learn the name of only because I asked her myself, twice, to be certain I had it right. It is not a simple tune. It is not, by any reasonable measure, a piece one plays to help move stock. It is a torrent, a piece built to test the nerve and the endurance of a trained concert pianist, full of hammering octaves and a melody that must sing out clear and unbroken above a storm of notes underneath it. And Alice Fenner played it from memory, in a gray uniform, on a showroom floor, for an audience that had gathered by accident, and a manager who had asked for a hymn. Her hands moved with a certainty that seemed almost to embarrass the instrument's own gleaming newness, as though the piano had been waiting its whole showroom life to be properly asked a question, and had only just now heard one. The left hand drove on, relentless, an engine of triplets that never once stumbled, while the right hand carried its aching, searching melody above the tumult, bending it, letting it swell and then draw back, as a tide draws back only to return larger. I watched her face rather than her hands for most of it. I could not help myself, and there was no anxiety left in it at all, none of the careful smallness she had worn a minute before. Her brows were drawn slightly together in concentration, her lips parted, and her whole being seemed to have gone somewhere the rest of us were only permitted to glimpse. There was a passage midway through, where the melody climbed by small aching steps, each one seeming to cost her something, and gain something in the same breath, and her right wrist rose with it, light as a bird lifting off water, while her left hand never once broke its dark, driving current beneath. Two entirely different weathers happening at once beneath the same 10 fingers, and somehow neither losing its way for an instant. The gathered crowd had by now become a proper crowd, drawn from every corner of that vast glass-roofed floor. Customers who had been examining upright pianos 3 departments away came drifting toward the sound as though pulled on a string, and among them, I noticed, the shop's own senior partner, old Mr. Whitmore himself, white-whiskered and leaning on his stick, who had come down, someone whispered, only to see about a delivery, and had stopped dead in the aisle between the grands. The storm in the piece built and built, the octaves hammering now with a force I would not have believed such slight shoulders could produce. And then, just when it seemed the sound could climb no further without breaking apart entirely, Alice Fenner brought it back, drew the tide out once more, softened the thunder into something aching and low, the melody now almost a whisper of itself, searching still, but gentler, as though it had stopped running and had turned at last to look behind it. Mr. Pemberton Reeve had sat down, quite without meaning to, on the bench of a neighboring upright, his watch still hanging forgotten from its chain. The final passage came like a held breath finally released, the melody rising once more, full-throated now, no longer searching but certain, carried up on a swell of sound that filled every corner of that glass-roofed hall, up past the chandeliers, past the ranks of silent, gleaming pianos standing witness on every side, and then, with a suddenness that made my own heart catch, it resolved. One last deep chord, struck and held, allowed to ring out into the stillness and fade, note by note, until the department was left in a silence so complete I could hear, quite absurdly, the ticking of Mr. Pemberton Reeve's own watch, still swinging gently on its chain. No one moved, no one, for what felt a very long moment, so much as breathed. And then it broke. First one pair of hands, from somewhere near the umbrella stand, then a dozen, then what felt like every soul on that floor, applause rolling up through the glass-roofed hall, the way the piece itself had rolled, shopgirls and clerks and customers, all forgetting entirely why they had come in, and old Mr. Whitmore himself, thumping the ferrule of his stick against the polished floor, in a rhythm of pure delight. Constance was on her toes beside me, clapping with both gloved hands raised above her head, and I found that my own eyes had filled in a manner I had not expected, and could not, just then, have explained to a stranger. Mr. Grimsby stood absolutely still at the center of it all, his face gone the color of good chalk, staring at the girl in the gray uniform, as though he were only now, for the first time, actually seeing her. It was Mr. Pemberton Reeve who rose first from the borrowed bench, straightening his waistcoat, clearing his throat twice before he trusted his own voice. "I will take the grand," he said, to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. "The one she is sitting at, whatever it costs." And then, turning to Mr. Grimsby, with the air of a man delivering a verdict, he added, "And you will tell your Miss Fenner, sir, that my wife shall want to hear her play again before the instrument is even delivered." Mr. Grimsby opened his mouth, closed it, and for a moment I believe the whole floor watched to see what manner of man he truly was, underneath the harried clerk's coat he wore. Then he crossed to the piano himself and, "I will remember this to the end of my days." He bowed to her, not the small inclination of a manager acknowledging an employee, but a proper bow, from the waist, the kind one gives a person one has gravely misjudged, and means, sincerely, to make amends to. "Miss Fenner," he said, and his voice when it came was not the brisk voice of 10 minutes before, but something considerably humbler. "I asked you for something simple. I am ashamed to say, I had no notion what I was asking a person capable of that to set aside." He glanced round at the crowd still murmuring its astonishment, at old Mr. Whitmore nodding slowly by the aisle, and seemed to gather himself. "From this day you are head demonstrator of this department, if you will have the post, and I mean to put it to Mr. Whitmore directly that we ought to hold a proper recital here of an evening, once a fortnight, say, with your name upon the card. It seems to me a shameful waste to have kept a talent such as yours folded up behind a service counter." He looked, as he said it, toward old Mr. Whitmore, who had by then made his way to the front of the crowd on the arm of a junior clerk, and the old gentleman nodded once, firmly, the nod of a man who did not need persuading twice about anything he had heard with his own ears. Alice Fenner, who had borne the dismissiveness of something simple, without a flicker, who had swallowed I do not know how many small unkindnesses in 2 years of playing hymn tunes for impatient customers, sat very still at the keyboard for a moment, with her hands now quiet in her lap, and I saw her throat work once before she trusted herself to speak. "I should like that very much, Mr. Grimsby," she said. "Thank you. I do not, as a rule, involve myself in the affairs of strangers. I had come to Whitmore and Sons to buy my daughter a piano, and nothing more. And I am, by nature and by my late husband's frequent teasing, a woman not easily moved to grand gestures in public places. But I found myself walking toward that grand piano before I had entirely decided to, with Constance trotting to keep pace beside me, and I introduced myself to Miss Fenner as she rose from the bench, and I asked her, quite plainly, who had taught her to play like that, and what had become of her lessons, and why in heaven's name a girl with such a gift was spending her days selling furniture to men who could not tell a moment musical from a music hall waltz. She told me, briefly and without a trace of self-pity, of Mr. Aldridge and St. Michael's, of her father's collapsed firm, of the 4 shillings a day that had seemed, 2 years ago, a mercy rather than a defeat. And I thought of my own daughter, standing there with her whole unspent future still folded up ahead of her like a clean sheet of paper, and of this other young woman who had very nearly had hers folded away for good behind a service counter, and I made up my mind, before I had even finished hearing the whole of her story. Miss Fenner, I said, I intend to speak to the Guildhall School on your behalf, and I intend to see that whatever fees stand between you and a proper place there are met, by me, and not spoken of again as a debt. I have heard a great many pianists in my life, in a great many drawing rooms far finer than this one, and I have never in 40 years heard anything to touch what you have just done in the middle of a department store on a Tuesday afternoon. She looked at me then with an expression I have seen only a handful of times since, in people who have waited a very long while for a door to open and had almost, though never entirely, stopped listening for the latch. She did not weep, though I confess I very nearly did on her behalf. She only said quietly, I have not stopped playing it in my head every night since I learned it. I did not think anyone here would ever want to hear it. Constance bought her instrument that same week, a modest upright, nothing so grand as Mr. Pemberton Reeves' concert grand, but a fine one all the same. And within the month, the Guildhall School had written back to confirm Alice Fenner's place. The fees settled quietly between my solicitor and theirs, and never once mentioned between the two of us as anything but a kindness passed forward, rather than a debt owed back. Mr. Grimsby was as good as his word besides. The recitals began that same autumn, held on alternate Thursday evenings among the ranked pianos with the gaslights turned up warm and gold, and Whitmore and Sons found, to its own considerable astonishment, that a crowd gathered to hear music sold nearly as many pianos as a crowd gathered to be sold one. Mr. Whitmore was heard to remark, more than once, that Miss Fenner's Thursdays had done more for the department's takings than any advertisement his firm had ever placed in a newspaper. I have since made it a point to attend every one of them that my calendar allows, the little card in the window always bearing, near the top now rather than nowhere at all, the name Miss Alice Fenner, and beneath it, in smaller letters this last year, of the Guildhall School of Music. Mr. Grimsby, I am told, still greets every customer with his same brisk courtesy, but I have watched him myself, more than once, stand quietly at the back of that crowd during her recitals, with his hands folded and his face entirely undefended, listening the way the rest of us listen, as a man grateful simply to have been in the room he once nearly hurried her out of. And I have thought, every single time the last chord fades and the silence holds before the applause breaks, that there is no furniture on any floor of any shop in London so valuable as what very nearly went unheard that Tuesday, and that I shall carry the sound of it, unasked for and undiminished, for the whole of my remaining life.